There are stories we keep in our hearts not because of their happy endings, but because of the winding, rocky roads that led us there. Stories that teach us the greatest danger doesn't always come from the outside, but from the people we choose to pull up a chair to our table. That's what you're going to hear about today. This is a story about a man who built everything with his bare hands, who placed his trust where he shouldn't have, who was deceived slowly, carefully, and methodically, and who only saw the truth because a simple woman, with no agenda other than doing what was right, had the courage to speak up when everyone else around them preferred to stay quiet and look the other way. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Every week, we bring you a new story with a real-life lesson, told the way only life knows how to teach. Our story begins on a late afternoon in 1983 in a small rural county town called Oakhaven, where the smell of diner coffee mixed with the dust of the back roads, and where everybody in a 20-mile radius knew the name Arthur Lawson. Arthur was 42 years old, and he carried the heavy posture of a man who had built a lot and lost a fair share along the way. He owned the local feed and seed store that sold everything from flour to fertilizer, a small freight company with 4 trucks running the state lines, and a stake in a young construction firm that was growing a little too fast for that quiet country town. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, graying temples, and the thick, calloused hands of someone who started working at dawn as a boy and never really stopped. He wasn't the type to smile for no reason, but when he did, you felt it was genuine. There was nothing rehearsed about Arthur. His wife had passed away 6 years earlier, taken by a sudden fever that the local Oakhaven doctor couldn't diagnose in time and that the specialist from the city arrived too late to treat. She left behind 2 young daughters, Mary and Claire, who were just 8 and 6 at the time. She also left a gaping hole in Arthur's chest that he tried to fill with sweat and elbow grease. He woke up before the sun, went to sleep long after midnight, and in that continuous, exhausting, and often lonely motion, he turned his grief into bricks, the bricks into walls, and the walls into a legacy for his girls. He was proud of that, maybe a little too proud, which sometimes caused him to lower his guard in places where he should have kept his eyes wide open. His partner in the construction firm was a woman named Victoria Sterling. She was 38, widowed like him, held an accounting degree from a university in the city, and had rolled into Oakhaven 3 years prior with a business proposal that made perfect sense on paper, and a presence that commanded the room. She handled the numbers, the county bids, the municipal contracts, and the spreadsheets that Arthur openly admitted he had a hard time deciphering. Arthur provided the capital, the local reputation, and the handshake contacts that 20 years of small-town commerce build slowly and protect fiercely. On paper, it was a perfectly balanced partnership. In practice, it was a partnership where one side had decided from day one that balance was just a temporary arrangement. The whole town figured they'd end up tying the knot. Victoria was beautiful, always impeccably dressed, wearing just the right perfume for every occasion, and she had a way of speaking that made men stop to listen and women watch out of the corner of their eyes. At town events, the country club dances, Sunday service, or the Chamber of Commerce meetings, she was always right by Arthur's side with a smile calibrated exactly to the occasion. He enjoyed her company. After 6 years of being a single father, he liked having someone around who understood the business world without needing a drawn-out explanation, who didn't question every move, who seemed to always be in his corner. What he failed to realize was that her silence wasn't understanding. It was strategy. And being in his corner meant, for Victoria, being as close to the wallet as possible. Martha Higgins was 53 years old and had been working in Arthur's home for 11 years. She was hired back before his wife passed, brought in to help when the girls were toddlers, and the old farmhouse was just too big for 2 busy parents to manage alone. She cooked, cleaned, ironed, and organized, and over time, she became part of the foundation of that house, in that quiet, indispensable way that only truly good people can manage. She wasn't one to speak more than necessary. She brewed the strong black coffee Arthur liked without ever being asked, draped a woven blanket over his shoulders on chilly November nights when he stayed out on the porch reading contracts, and never, not once in 11 years of living under that roof, touched a single dime that didn't belong to her. She had a face lined by the sun and hard work, dark hair with streaks of silver always pulled back into a tight bun, and hands that told a whole story of honest labor. She was originally from a tiny farming community upstate, sent money back to her elderly mother every single month without fail, sat in the front pews of First Grace Church every Sunday morning, and knew the other regulars by name. The folks at the local grocer asked about her if she missed her usual Tuesday run. She was the kind of person a town instantly notices when they're gone, but rarely stops to thank while they're there. Martha saw everything. It was in her nature to observe, not out of gossip or nosiness, but because anyone who works inside a home for over a decade learns to read the signals the owners don't even know they're broadcasting. The slight shift in a voice's tone when a mind is wandering. The way papers on a desk are shuffled between morning and afternoon without anyone intentionally moving them. The way certain people walk into a room and make all the air feel heavy. And in the final months of 1983, the signals inside that farmhouse were speaking much louder than the silence Arthur stubbornly maintained. It started with the phone calls. Victoria would call far too late for it to be strictly business, and when Martha walked down the hall with a laundry basket at hours when the phone rarely rang, she'd hear Arthur's voice drop. It got lower, more guarded, as if the words were being chosen with a caution that standard business affairs wouldn't require. Then came the off-the-books visits to the construction office, something Martha found out by pure chance. Arnie, the CPA's wife, chatting idly in the produce aisle, accidentally let slip that certain meetings were happening off the ledger. And then came the afternoon. Arthur left a credit card statement on the kitchen island next to an empty mug. When Martha reached to wash the mug, she couldn't help but see the printed numbers. Numbers that didn't line up at all with the hushed living room conversations she'd overheard about the company's tight margins and struggling cash flow. She wasn't a CPA. She didn't know the first thing about corporate balances, ledgers, or expense classifications. But she knew people, and what she saw happening to the man she had worked for 11 years, the man she had seen weeping at the kitchen table the night his wife died, the man she saw pacing the porch at 4 a.m. with a coffee cup because the grief wouldn't let him sleep, was a man being methodically, slowly bled dry by someone who knew exactly how to do it without leaving a mess. The question that weighed heavily on Martha's chest for 3 whole weeks was simple: what to do with what she knew. It wasn't an easy call. She was the housekeeper. She knew exactly what kind of place Oakhaven society, and really any rural American town in the 80s, reserved for the help who meddled in their boss's affairs. She had seen it happen to other women, in other houses. Cautionary tales whispered at church bake sales. The housekeeper who talks too much gets a pink slip. The housekeeper who accuses the boss's polished business partner without hard proof becomes the crazy villain of the story. And what if she was wrong? What if it was just a string of misunderstandings, a puzzle her own tiredness or unfair suspicion had put together in her head? But something weighed heavier than her fear of being wrong, heavier than her fear of losing her job, and heavier than the town's judgment. What weighed on her was the image of Arthur on the porch on a Friday night, looking out at the stars, planning a future he didn't know had already been mortgaged behind his back. What weighed on her was how much that man had sacrificed, how much of his own soul he had poured into every brick of his life's work. What weighed on her was genuine gratitude, not the subservient kind of someone trapped by a paycheck, but the pure gratitude of a good person who recognizes kindness and refuses to stand by while it gets taken advantage of. On a quiet Tuesday morning, after Mary and Claire had caught the yellow school bus, and the house settled into that specific, peaceful hum of a weekday, Martha brewed the coffee, set the mug on her usual tray, and walked up the stairs to Arthur's home office. She knocked twice with her knuckles, walked in when he called out, and set the mug down on the wooden desk. But she didn't turn around to leave. She stood right there in the doorway, her hands folded neatly over her apron. Arthur looked up at her, caught in the middle of a thought he didn't want to lose track of. Papers were scattered everywhere, his pen hovering over a signature line. But something in Martha's posture, a stiff, contained energy that was entirely unlike her, made him slowly lower the pen and wait. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. She spoke in a tone almost identical to the one she used to announce that supper was ready, but with an undercurrent of iron that hit him in the chest before his brain even processed the words. "Your partner is stealing from you, Mr. Arthur." She let the pause linger for exactly the right amount of time. "I know it ain't my place, but it would be a sin for me to stay quiet knowing what I know." The silence that filled the room after that lasted too long to be comfortable, but was too heavy to be empty. Arthur stared at Martha with a look she couldn't entirely read, a mix of emotions she couldn't quite put a name to. For a fleeting second her stomach dropped, terrified she had crossed a line she could never uncross. But she didn't look away. She had come too far to back down, and more than that, she had too much conviction to feel ashamed. Arthur slowly closed the manila folder on his desk. He asked her to sit down, and he asked her to tell him everything, using the exact same calm, steady voice he used to make the biggest decisions of his life. It wasn't the calm of indifference. It was the anchor some men drop to keep their feet on the ground when the earth starts shaking. Martha told him. With the same economy of words she applied to everything else. No drama, no exaggeration, no petty judgments. Just facts. The late-night phone calls, the off-book office visits, the credit card statement she hadn't meant to read, but did. The CPA's wife slipping up at the grocery store. When she was done, she folded her hands back in her lap and waited. Arthur sat there for a long time, his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped over his mouth, his eyes fixed on a dead spot on the wall above the paperwork. When he finally spoke, his question surprised her more than any anger would have. "Why did you tell me this, Martha?" There was no accusation in his tone, just a profound, honest curiosity from a man trying to understand the heart of another human being. Martha placed her hand lightly on the doorframe as she stood up to leave. "Because you're a good man, and because it would be wrong to let a good man get robbed blind in his own house." He nodded once, slowly, with a gravity that felt like a deep bow of respect. He asked her not to breathe a word to anyone, not in the house, not to the girls, not in town. He thanked her with the same quiet restraint he had used to ask, without a hug or grand gestures, just a heavy sincerity that was worth more than 1,000 pretty words. Martha walked downstairs and went straight to the kitchen to wash the breakfast dishes. Her hands didn't shake. What happened next was exactly what Arthur did best when the ground got unstable. He moved with patience, and he moved with method. He kept going into the construction office every day. He kept sitting across from Victoria, smiling when he needed to, signing what needed signing. Except this time, he read every single line of fine print before his pen hit the paper. He admitted to himself, during one of the many sleepless nights that followed, that he had stopped doing that a long time ago. He had outsourced his vigilance. He had mistaken trust for complacency, and someone had picked the lock he forgot to check. Through his family lawyer, he quietly reached out to a forensic auditor all the way up in Nashville, someone with zero ties to Oakhaven or anyone in the county. He ordered a deep dive audit of the last 2.5 years of the company's books, giving absolutely no context. The auditor came down quietly, spent 3 days locked in a borrowed back office 2 towns over with copies of the ledgers, and then spent 2 weeks compiling the final report. Arthur read that report alone with his office door locked on a Saturday afternoon while the girls were at a friend's house. He read it once. He read it again. On the third pass, he stopped on a specific page and stared at the numbers until they blurred. Victoria had been skimming, not all at once. That would have been sloppy. She had been bleeding the accounts slowly over 2 years, using expense reclassifications that looked like innocent bookkeeping errors, petty cash adjustments, a lazy accountant would write off as administrative slop, and bloated vendor contracts. The auditor traced those vendors back to a shell company Arthur had never heard of, but which had Victoria's fingerprints all over the incorporation papers. All tallied up, the stolen amount hit Arthur with a physical pressure in his chest. It wasn't white-hot anger. It was that specific hollow disappointment that only hits you when the person holding the knife is someone you had bared your back to. It wasn't just the money. It was sitting at the same table for 3 years. It was telling her about his girls, about his late wife, about his dreams for the next decade. It was the fact that he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, something that was incredibly hard for him, with someone who was filing away that vulnerability as tactical leverage. He didn't cry. He looked out his office window for a long time, watching the Tennessee sun dip below the tree line, casting long shadows over his yard. Then he picked up the rotary phone and called his lawyer. The months that followed were the hardest Arthur had faced since the funeral, just in a completely different way. There was the legal battlefield, handled as quietly as a small town allows, but with the ruthless grip the situation demanded. There was the financial reality, the crater the embezzlement left in the company's operating budget that had to be faced with brutal honesty about what was gone forever. And then there was the heaviest burden of all, looking in the mirror and reckoning with how he had let himself go blind at the wheel for so long. That was what kept him up at 4 a.m., sitting out on the porch with a coffee mug, staring up at an Oakhaven winter sky that was just a little too clear, a little too full of stars for a man with a head full of dark questions. Early one freezing morning, Martha woke up ahead of schedule and headed down to start the coffee. She found Arthur still on the porch, his mug long empty, his eyes 1,000 miles away. She didn't say a word. She brewed a fresh pot, poured him a hot cup, and set it on the railing next to the cold one. She was already turning back to the door when he spoke, his voice gravelly from the cold air. He told her he had spent a lot of time thinking about why she risked her livelihood to tell him the truth. He admitted that if he had been in her shoes, with 11 years of job security on the line and a mother to feed, he wasn't sure he would have had the same spine. Martha paused in the doorway. She pulled her sweater a little tighter against the chill and said, "Mr. Arthur, there ain't a paycheck in this world worth the price of keeping quiet when you know something's rotten." Arthur stayed silent, but the silence that morning felt entirely different from the heavy nights before. Victoria was served by the lawyers on a crisp October morning during a formal meeting called in the very boardroom of the construction firm. Arthur was at the head of the table. His lawyer was to his right. The Nashville audit report was dead center. The ice in Arthur's veins that morning belonged to a man who had spent months processing a betrayal and who had come out the other side without needing to yell to make himself heard. Victoria tried everything. It was a sequence the lawyer later called painfully predictable. First came the denial, then the minimizing, then the gaslighting, trying to twist the narrative to claim Arthur had verbally authorized those investments on dates she specifically picked out, knowing he couldn't definitively prove a negative. But when she realized the paper trail was bulletproof and that Arthur had walked into that room anticipating every single one of her lies, the polished, sophisticated shield she had worn for 3 years shattered. What crawled out from underneath, raw and unmasked, was a cold, calculating rage. The specific anger of a con artist furious at being caught doing exactly what they set out to do. The partnership was dissolved immediately. The settlement forced her to forfeit her entire equity in the company, at pennies on the dollar, to cover a portion of the stolen funds. She was cornered. If she fought it, Arthur's lawyer promised to take the audit to the district attorney, which would trade her designer suits for a state-issued jumpsuit. Victoria left Oakhaven 12 days later. She packed her bags and boarded a Greyhound bus late on a Tuesday afternoon. No goodbyes. No explanations to her high society friends, who were left scrambling to piece the puzzle together. The town took care of the rest, as small towns do, filling in the blanks with wilder and wilder theories at the diner counters and beauty parlors, until the actual truth was buried under 10 layers of Southern Gothic drama. The Oakhaven Chamber of Commerce held its annual gala every December in the ballroom of the county hotel. White tablecloths, the same roasted chicken dinner as last year, and the same tired speeches about the year behind and the year ahead. Arthur had gone for a decade, mostly out of duty, enduring the ritual with the patience of a man who respects his community even if he doesn't love small talk. But that December of 1983, the air in the room was electric with a new topic. Victoria's sudden exit had birthed a wave of that convenient retrospective wisdom people only ever find after the storm has passed. Folks who had kissed the ground she walked on suddenly had always known something was off. The sheriff mentioned he never liked the way she avoided eye contact. The mayor suddenly felt there was a lack of transparency in her bids. The wife of a prominent rancher leaned over her wineglass and whispered that she never trusted that woman's smile. Arthur listened to all of it during dinner. He didn't argue. He just let the hypocrisy wash over him. Calling them out wasn't the point. The point arrived when the president of the chamber stood up to deliver the closing remarks. Gerald Miller was a good-natured, heavy-set man who had a gift for turning any topic into a cliché without losing his booming, authoritative tone. That night, Gerald decided to preach about trust, solid partnerships, and the unbreakable bonds that guide the honest business of a God-fearing community. When Gerald finally sat down to polite applause, Arthur Lawson stood up. The room went dead silent. Everyone knew Arthur wasn't a speech giver. He was a handshake in the back room kind of man. People straightened up in their chairs, captivated by the sheer rarity of the moment. Arthur stood there, resting his knuckles on the white tablecloth. He didn't tap a glass, he didn't clear his throat, he just looked across the room and spoke for less than 3 minutes. He told them that this year he had learned a lesson he thought he already knew, but apparently had to pay a very high premium to learn again. He said that trust isn't a switch you flip once at the start of a partnership and then leave alone. Trust is a daily practice. It's an attention you cannot delegate. It's keeping your eyes open even when the sun is shining. He admitted plainly that he had made the mistake of falling asleep at the wheel. And then he said that the person who woke him up wasn't a high-priced lawyer or an old business buddy or a connected politician. The person who saved him was a woman who had worked in his kitchen for 11 years. A woman who had absolutely no obligation to speak up, who stood to lose the roof over her head, but who risked her own safety simply because she couldn't stomach watching a wrong being done. He never said Martha's name. Arthur wasn't the kind of man to put someone on a pedestal as a prop for a story, not even a story of gratitude, but anyone who knew Arthur, and in Oakhaven that was just about everyone, knew exactly who he was talking about. When he finished, the silence held for a few heavy seconds. And then the applause broke out. It wasn't the polite golf clap applause of social obligation. It was a loud, thundering applause from people who had just heard the raw, unvarnished truth and felt it deep in their bones. On Christmas morning, before loading Mary and Claire into the station wagon for the early church service, Arthur left a plain white envelope on the kitchen island. On the front, in his wide, slanted handwriting, was Martha's name. Inside was a cashier's check, a bonus large enough that Martha would be able to send her mother triple her usual amount for a very long time. Tucked behind the check was a piece of paper, folded in half. On it was a single sentence that Arthur had drafted and scratched out twice before finding the right words. It read, "11 years of loyalty are worth more than I knew how to recognize. Thank you for not staying quiet when it was the easiest thing to do." Martha came into the kitchen at 6 in the morning to start the coffee and found the envelope. She read the note once, then again, then a third time. She folded it back exactly along its crease and slipped it into her apron pocket while the coffee brewed. Later that night, when she retreated to her room at the back of the house, she took that note and tucked it into the plastic sleeve where she kept her birth certificate, right inside the heavy family Bible on her nightstand. She never told a soul about it. There was no need. Oakhaven kept on being Oakhaven. The dirt roads kept kicking up dust in the summer and turning to thick mud in the spring. Arthur's feed store kept opening at 6 a.m. sharp, smelling of grain and coffee. The construction firm was rebuilt with a new partner, a local engineer Arthur had known since high school, a man whose character had been stress-tested by decades of real life, not by a fancy presentation. Mary and Claire grew up. They went off to college in the city. But they always came back for holidays and summers, and when they did, the kitchen filled up with that loud, chaotic joy that Martha had always associated with the concept of a complete home. Martha kept brewing the strong coffee, kept bringing the blanket out to the porch on freezing nights, and kept the house running on her steady, unbreakable rhythm, the kind of rhythm carried by the unseen people who hold the world together from the inside out. The story that actually stuck around Oakhaven, the one the old-timers still bring up when Arthur Lawson's name is mentioned, isn't the story of the embezzlement. Betrayals are a dime a dozen. They don't make for good legends. The story that survived is the one about the housekeeper, who walked into the boss's office with a cup of coffee on a Tuesday morning and said exactly what needed to be said, expecting nothing in return. That story stuck around because it's rare. Because it's the kind of story we tell each other not just to remember the past, but to remind ourselves of what's possible, to remind ourselves of what human beings are capable of when they're built out of the right material on the inside. And as anyone from a small town knows, that material has absolutely nothing to do with what's in your bank account. It has to do with what you do when nobody is watching, when the risk is real, when doing the right thing actually costs you something. Martha knew that before she walked up those stairs with the tray in her hands, and she knew it just as well when she walked back down them with empty hands and a perfectly clear conscience. Have you ever had someone like that in your life? Someone who hit you with the hard truth when it would have been much easier and safer for them to just smile and stay quiet? Let us know down in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story touched your heart today, share it with someone who you think needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Every week we've got a new story waiting for you here, told exactly the way life teaches it. We'll see you in the next video.